Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, OTJ community. I am excited to be jumping into our next church history nugget. This one specifically studying and focusing on the fall of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. So just a quick kind of catch up for those of us who are kind of new and didn't catch the first one. Church history nuggets are kind of, I wanted them to be nuggets, but they're actually turning into deep dives because I'm learning so much into church history, jumping into really figuring out what happened in certain moments in history and seeing how they affect our, the way that we see church and the way that we see God today, as well as they're awesome just case studies and seeing what God did in certain times. And from that, maybe we can figure out more of what he did. So this one, I'm trying to keep these shorter, but it's very hard to keep these short because I learn a lot and I love to talk. So this will be kept online. If you got to tune out, that's fine. We're going to keep it on, so feel free to watch it anytime where it's good for you. But I'm excited to jump into this subject. Last week, we talked about just kind of the very complicated swirl of culture and political climate that the church started out of. And this week we're going to talk about really when the Jewish temple was destroyed in 70 AD, which in a way didn't birth Christianity, but absolutely took a huge step to define it. As we jump into just kind of the context of this, we find that actually Christianity and Judaism at the very beginning looked a lot alike. And this permanently separated them, making them completely very different. As you know, Luke 6 talks about 37 and 38, that the new wine of Christianity could not fit in the old wineskin of Judaism. And they split and were, in a way that they could never be joined together again. But let's jump into it. Well, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the context of what happened. And it's important for us to understand that Christianity really, really emerged from some very thick Jewish-like practices and Jewish roots. And actually, there's the moment of Jesus's death, and then, there's the apostles, and then following is kind of Pentecost, where there's this event that happened outside of the temple. That in itself could be a huge sermon. But then afterwards, actually, Peter runs into the temple and explains what's happened, explained what happened with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit and Jesus being the Messiah, and a handful of members join up to be Christians. But from that point on, there's a couple of years where Christianity would have looked very, very similar to Judaism, aside from just a couple of practices. I mean, a lot of the original believers of Jesus and all of the apostles were Jews. And even though they knew that Jesus was probably the final sacrifice from sins, there was no reason for them to stop doing the feasts. They probably just talked about Jesus the whole time. They would have looked and acted a lot like the Jews that were around. Jesus asked for, once you become a Christian, repent from your sins. They probably would have stopped doing sin sacrifices at that point and be baptized, which honestly the Jews were already doing, and it was already a common practice. As the church started, they really looked a lot alike, and the Christians met even in the Jewish temple. Keep in mind, the Jewish temple at that time, Jerusalem at the time of Jesus was around 40,000 people big, and if half of those were Jews, which it was kind of speculated, that means that about 20,000 people in that town had regular goings to the Jewish temple. That is a humongous infrastructure. I mean, we have probably 2 or 3 churches in the world that are close to that size. I know a couple are a little bit bigger. But as Christianity probably started and even met in this Jewish temple, and they gathered and they probably talked and they hung out, and then afterwards they join in what everyone else was doing. It was probably really easy for them at first to run under the radar. Just because the temple system was so big, and they looked a lot like them. They were all Jews too that initially started. But as time went on, the division between Christianity and Judaism began to split more and more. One of the things that was really interesting is that the Christians, the people that would subscribe to Christianities, a huge group that actually this originally took off with was a group called the Hellenists. Now, the Hellenists were people that were Jews, but they also spoke Greek. And to the Jewish worldview and the mindset, they would have looked like kind of less than Greeks because they would have been associating with kind of the other world at that time. Now, the Jews, like in Jerusalem, it was actually only half Jewish at that time. There was a huge Roman population, there was a huge Greek population. And it just made a lot of sense to speak their language because you could trade with them, you could do life with them, you had more opportunities if you did. A lot of the Jewish thinking at that time was, though, that to actually reject this and kind of run from this. This is a worldly influence. We are the people of God. They are not. So let's actually keep a firm distance. So the Hellenists were looked to as the Jews is not as great people, kind of lower in the religious total, in the religious, ranking. They were less godly because they spoke Greek. But it was interesting that those people were kind of the people that Christianity really began to took off first in Jerusalem. The Hellenists were just open to kind of newer ideas. These are people that may have been Greek or may have believed different languages or different religions a couple, generations back. They were just more open to new ideas. And as Christianity began to spread, it spread with a lot of them first. Now, the apostles thought this was great because Jesus talked to the Hellenists, and they thought, obviously, Jesus didn't have a problem with them, so we shouldn't either. But as the church grew, the division kind of split. You guys might remember Stephen and Philip and a couple other deacons were selected because the Christians weren't doing as good of a job with the welfare program, with the Greek widows. So they picked actually Hellenist leaders and deacons because of that to kind of mend the situation. But Stephen, who I think this is amazing, I learned this, he's probably only a Christian for about 3 or 4 years, started preaching in the synagogues about Jesus, started really going after it. He actually wound up causing a huge riot about Christianity. That full-blown developed into the religious system, like realizing, okay, like at first we arrested the apostles, we beat them up a little bit to make them quiet. Keep in mind, the apostles were not the first person that thought that Jesus or the Messiah had come back. It actually happened a handful of times in those times. And the Jewish probably authorities had just kind of realized, well, you arrest them and then you see what happens. Most of these times, these guys wind up getting killed by the Romans sooner or later. There's no reason for us to get our hands bloody doing this, and it makes us look bad. But Stephen caused a pretty big stir and a pretty big riot. So what happened is the Jewish authorities realized they were to a point where they had to crack down on these guys. So they stoned Stephen, making him the first kind of Christian martyr. And then from that, they start to heavily oppress the Christians in Jerusalem. Now the Christians are primarily more outside of Jerusalem in the surrounding cities and kind of in the Hellenist quarters. But with the crackdown on the Christians, the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, a lot of them just kind of scattered and moved out. You can tell that there were some definitely a headquarters in Jerusalem, but a lot of them didn't stay. They spread out, and it was a great thing because the gospel just moved out into a bigger context. They went out throughout the countryside, Judea, which would have just been the countryside of Israel, into other nations nearby. Syria would have been, even the Christian capital was pretty soon established, or quote, the headquarters. It's kind of loosely defined in Antioch. What happened is the Jews cracked down in Jerusalem, Christianity spread all around that area, which is interesting because that meant, and then, Peter had his vision, the Gentiles are brought into this thing. They began actively trying to convert Gentiles. Then afterwards, a bunch of other things. Paul, he's oppressing the church, and then he quickly flips, and then before you know it, he's going on all these missionary journeys. All of these little churches are planting up all over the Mediterranean and stuff like that. What winds up happening is with the crackdown of the Jews in Jerusalem, Christianity begins to shift from kind of a Jewish, a religion with Jewish roots to really more of a Gentile religion. As time goes on, probably by the time that, in AD 62, the last big Jewish leader in Jerusalem, James, is put to death by the Jewish authorities. Most Christians are probably more Gentile than they are Jewish. And in the context of that, there were a lot of decisions and talks and things that happened amidst that. You had a religion and a framework of believing in God being very tied to a specific nationality and people group and active practices. In something like 20 years, the people that are following Jesus are no longer doing those things, and they're no longer those people. They come in with their own worldviews, their own traditions, and stuff like that. The face of Christianity dramatically changed in 30 years to something that was very Jewish to something that was very Gentile. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But that is kind of the background of actually the destruction of the Jewish temple. By the time we get to AD 66, really when the Romans started moving against Jerusalem, a lot of the Christians had kind of moved out of that area, and there probably wasn't a huge group. But I want to talk about how the temple and Jerusalem itself was kind of destroyed. It started, things with the Jews and the Romans were always not great. The Romans, and a lot of it came down to worship. The Romans, if you were a Roman province, you just had to make sacrifices to Caesar and worship him, and the Jews never did that. Which was interesting because a lot of the other world didn't have problems with that. If you were Greek, you were already worshiping Hercules or Aphrodite or whatever. What's another guy on your shelf? Just one day a year, you're making sacrifices to him instead of somewhere else. But the Jews would always push back against this. At times, the Romans would be like, oh, it's okay. Like, we'll let you not worship Caesar, but we will still have troops and garrisons in your town. You still got to pay taxes to us. At other times, they'll crack down and they'll demand worship, and that created lots of conflicts. Now, keep in mind, not everyone in Jerusalem was Jewish, so the Greeks were doing this anyways. It was more about kind of the Jews treating the Romans and stuff like that. But it got really, really bad in 80. In 66 AD, the tensions between the people in Jerusalem and the Greek people kind of living in Judea in that time, between the Jews, it was always kind of bad. Keep in mind, there's kind of the population that speaks Greek, that it identifies more with being Roman, and the other side that sees itself as Jewish people. And the tensions between those groups were kind of always bad. And politically, there was kind of a moment where the Greeks kind of won this political, I'm not sure what it was, none of my sources kind of say this political win against the Jews. They very barbarically celebrated that by slaughtering a bunch of Jews, while the Roman soldiers, who were supposed to protect the Jews, just kind of watched and let it happen. Once that word hit Jerusalem, the Jews were obviously super furious. They in turn totally attacked the Roman garrison in that town, and they actually slaughtered them and defeated them, actually kicking out the Roman military presence of Jerusalem, which was huge to them. They had been oppressed by these guys back and forth for the last 400 years. At times they had kicked them out, and they had really attributed them as acts of God when it happened. I mean, the Romans were a tough fight, and if you could kick them out of your town, it means something amazing happened. So in AD 66, they wind up pushing these guys out. Now, Rome obviously can't just let that slide, so they start moving against Jerusalem. They wind up kind of starting with kind of the port towns. They wind up sending 4 legions, which I believe is, yep, there you go. I had to look at the notes. 20,000 people against Jerusalem. They move into the coastal towns, and they don't just kind of sit there. They do a fair amount of killing and slaughtering, and they start marching towards Jerusalem. In AD 68, though, the general Vespasian, who is kind of leading the main attack against kind of the Jews in Jerusalem, Nero winds up dying, and Vespasian is actually kind of a guy who has a spot at becoming the emperor, so he actually winds up taking off back to Rome, and the offense actually takes a break for, it seems like a year or so. They're moving up against Jerusalem, and then their general leaves, so they just camp out and hang out for a year. Vespasian does wind up winning the emperor, but he winds up sending his son Titus to kind of finish his job. So then Titus kind of picks back up in 68, and then afterwards he starts moving against Jerusalem. In April of 20 or 70 AD, the troops begin to actively siege Jerusalem, and it was just a terrible, terrible situation. The suffering inside the city would have just been horrific. Overall, Jerusalem at the time of Jesus was something like 40,000 people, and by the time 70 AD, so that's 40 years later, I mean, the town more or less It said overall that the estimated war of kind of, the the Romans moving in and then moving up to Jerusalem and then destroying it. They said over 1 million probably people wind up dying in this war overall. An estimated population of 70,000 people probably died in Jerusalem. 30,000 were probably in the cities around them. The Jews held out for about 7 months until September, when the most jealous, the Romans punched through. They kind of took it street by street until the last, zealous Jews kind of made their last stand in the temple. But then they kind of couldn't hold out, and they wound up being defeated. But this is a really, really interesting event. And there's actually a lot of little things that happen in this that are not quite provable historically. And I mean, there's accounts, but there's kind of only one. And when you're trying to do history, you're trying to get multiple stories kind of converging on a point to kind of find the truth. But there's a lot of really interesting things that happen. First off, the siege would have been awful. And if it wasn't cut short by the Romans actually punching in, it said that probably everyone would have been dead within about a year. The Jews were just not ready for it. They camped around the city. There's no food going in, no food going out. There's death happening in there, disease is spreading and stuff like that. It was just awful. The Romans knew how to take cities really, really well, and they did it in a very barbaric way. Sounds like the suffering inside would have been almost kind of a biblical proportion of just kind of judgment. But one of the things that's really interesting is when you read about kind of the accounts that happened during the siege and kind of around the siege. One of the things that was really fascinating is that Titus himself didn't actually want to start. There's kind of two conflicting stories of it. First, he didn't think he wanted to destroy the temple, and then he was sure he wanted to destroy the temple. He thought, well, if I can just stop the temple, then I could just cut the head off the snake of the Jews, and we'll stop these riots. We'll stop having to come back to these people and cracking down on these people and putting these people into order. But one of the things that I think is especially fascinating is this. There are a lot of there's stories that kind of align that actually none of the Christians in the destruction of the Jerusalem died. They actually heeded the warning that Jesus gave in all of the Gospels that, hey, the Romans are going to come. When you see the armies encamped around the city, flee to the hills. Like, if you're pregnant during those times, it's going to be kind of a bummer because it's going to be hard to get out of there. But a lot of the accounts say is when Vespasian went over to become the emperor, and there was kind of that lull as the Romans were marching up to Jerusalem, the Christians actually, by a vision, were warned and wound up leaving the city. And the account of the vision is really interesting. It's actually from Josephus, who was not a Christian. He said, supposedly there was this sign in the heavens, and what's described as you would look up in the sky and you would just see armies of people in gold and in chariots circling around the city above. Just this massive sort of troop movement moving above the city. And from there was this loud voice that spoke one day that said, let them go out from here. At which point all the Christians, they left. They knew what was coming. This is all of what Jesus predicted. This is what the apostles actually warned us about. It's time for us to go. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the Christians had left Jerusalem at that point. Christianity was developing much quicker outside of Jerusalem than it was. Jerusalem had a lot of persecution. They had killed James. That was the last apostle there. Stephen had been stoned. Kind of the Christian capital had moved to Antioch already. Paul's he would have actually been dead by then. But a lot of, Paul and Peter, they had already been martyred, but those guys went to Rome to try to get something started there. When the Christians left Jerusalem, there probably weren't that many of them leaving. And it probably wasn't a super obvious thing. It was just a bunch of people left then. And if you really didn't know it was the Christian, it might have looked just like, okay, a big group left. But there were probably big groups leaving all the time because they knew the Romans were coming. The Jewish people, though, thought that this sign was actually God endorsing them. And so they decided to hunker down even tighter, to get even more prepared, to really think, hey, this sign is showing that God is on our side. In the past, we read about this in the book of the Maccabees, they had beaten the Romans before, and they attributed it as kind of a divine act. It's God saying he's going to defend us again. It's God saying that he's going to keep us safe again. But obviously we know that what wind up doesn't happening. One last story, which I think is amazing, is Titus himself, after you won a victory in Rome, you were called back to like Rome, and then the emperor would actually put a crown of olive branches around your head, and you get to dress like the emperor, which means you would get to look like God one day, because the emperor was kind of like a man-God thing. So for one day, you got to be God, and people would worship you. It'd be great because you won this victory. But actually, Titus rejected the crown when they gave it to him, like some accounts say, because he actually felt that that story was, or that city, Jerusalem, was destroyed by God, not by him. He actually saw it as a divine act. Now, there's a lot of things that are kind of said back then. I think they're really interesting. I don't know. I'm more inclined to believe these things than not, just because I believe in the supernatural. It's hard to kind of verify these stories, though, but I think they're super interesting. But one of the things that we can say with 100% confidence, that historically a lot really changed with the destruction of Jerusalem. By the way, that everything that Jesus says was faithfully true. The temple was totally destroyed. I used to wonder about the Wailing Wall. I was like, well, how did every stone get torn down if there's still the Wailing Wall? And if you actually look at pictures of the Wailing Wall was part of the temple, but it was actually kind of a retaining wall. Like, it was the wall they built up, and there's actually earth behind it. And then there's kind of ground up here, and up here is where the temple was. This little retaining wall is the only thing that the Romans left. They killed all the priests, they took all the instruments and all that. That little retaining wall is the Wailing Wall. So they did faithfully knock down every stone, like Jesus said. But one of the things that happened with that is two super, super important historical things. Number one, the Jewish religion of that time totally ended. There were no more priests. There were no more vessels for sacrifices. The temple, which was the center point of that religion, was destroyed. What Judaism evolved into was actually more of a teaching religion, where it used to be about gathering in the temple. Now it became about teaching and reading the book together. Obviously, they learned back then, but back then, really only the priests had time to really study the scriptures. The average person, you and me, the 90% of that population would just go and hear sermons and make sacrifices and take part in the feasts. But Judaism changed a lot, and actually probably changed closer to what the Pharisees were practicing, where it became a religion that was a lot more about learning under people than going to the temple to celebrate. So Judaism totally changed at that point. They would say they believe in the same God, to my knowledge, and follow a lot of the same practices, but they can't. It's not the same thing. There's not the temple. There's not the sacrifices. What's most important is that the law itself became impossible to follow from that point on. You could sin in the law, you just had to make sacrifices. Well, there's no longer ways to make those sacrifices. It is the official end of the law. And lastly, the church itself, which emerged from these Jewish practices, this Jewish identity, that itself was officially ended. The wineskin totally burst open. The wine was poured out. And Christianity had to kind of learn how to stand on its own. And it had to figure out a new identity, being one of more Gentiles than of Jews, ones that you'll continue to see. So a couple life takeaways. I know that was kind of long, but I want to kind of hit, hopefully you found the history interesting. I want to hit kind of how this applies to us. In lieu of it being February, which is Black History Month, a month where we celebrate the accomplishments of Black African Americans, but also keep in mind the backdrop of civil rights and the racial issues that Americans had faced. Racism was a huge issue back then. It's more and more Christians that are Gentiles are coming into this thing, and we've always thought this thing was only for Jews. These guys are not the in crowd. These guys do not know what it's like. To simplify racism, there's a race that is an in crowd, and there's a race that is an out crowd, and the in crowd generally oppresses the out crowd. That was the conflict that a lot of the early church and Christians were facing. How do we incorporate these people into something that we view as sort of more or less a Jewish background who aren't Jews? And it's really fascinating that as we read the Gospels that were written maybe 30 years or so after Jesus died, they specifically really target these issues. The Gospels themselves intentionally accredit Romans and Samaritans In Acts, you have an Ethiopian. They intentionally, the authors, which I attribute to be the apostles, and the apostles, the people that the apostles gave a head on to, and the work of the Holy Spirit combined, intentionally leave in a ton of scriptures about race and showing that these people who were the out crowd are now the new in crowd. The point of the Gospels and Acts with those sermons is that the family of faith no longer has a skin color, that it's open to all. And actually, the racism that you would find in those times wasn't necessarily from God. It was more from man. Actually, if you read the old law, or if you read the law in the Levitical account, there were ways for Gentiles to actually come into the Jewish inheritance. It was totally possible and even meant for them to do it. But that elitism and that kind of racism that kind of spurred from the Jewish thinking, that was primarily coming out of man and not God. And it's amazing to see that it's one of the first issues that the church had to reconcile with. And it's also something that the gospel really seems to really target, and women too, that the people of God no longer have a skin color, that all the people of God, all are people of God, that God doesn't have a race or a nationality, that it's open to all. And thank God it did, because without that, probably people like me and the majority of people of you guys who are chiming in on OTJ wouldn't have come to know the truth if it stayed in Jerusalem. So it's awesome to think that, that the Bible and even the church in the beginning of the church, ideas like how we see other racism and who God works with are obviously in the backdrop of that, and are good things for us to think about today. God doesn't have an in crowd with race. A second thing that's really important that I think to think of it is this. The Bible is written in the context of the apostles knowing that Jesus was going to come back and that there was going to be kind of this destruction of the temple. Now, a lot of them kind of tie two things together of, the day of the Lord, which was always looked at as the day that God comes back, but also the absolutely destruction and end of evil and the destruction of the Jewish temple. Jesus kind of speaks about these things kind of back and forth in Matthew, I think it's 24. And it's hard to know exactly what the apostles believed, because we see the day of the Lord as something that hasn't happened, and the destruction of Jerusalem obviously is something that has happened. It's impossible to know if I think the apostles saw it that way, but they write the book in the Bible really knowing that Jesus was coming back in their generation, which means to them, they knew that Jesus was going to come back and destroy the temple in 40 years. And it's in the backdrop of a lot of the literature that they read. You'll read about it in 2 Peter. He specifically talks about the day of the Lord. They knew that God was coming back soon. The book of Hebrews, which was written to Hebrews in Jerusalem that were heavily oppressed by the Jews, getting very close to 70 AD, talks a lot about this context. Don't go back to the law. Don't go back to worshiping or to sin and to sin sacrifices, because there is this fear of judgment that's coming. Jesus told us that this religion, the temple, it's all going to end in fire. Don't go back. There's a judgment that's coming. The apostles absolutely took this as very seriously and really saw it as their job to keep banging the drum about it. There's a lot of people that didn't meet Jesus, that didn't hear those warnings, and they knew intentionally they had to keep telling people and keep letting people know, hey, there's going to be a bad day coming. Jesus is coming back to destroy the temple. As well as, I want to be very careful on kind of the ice that I'm treading. I am not endorsing an end times theology. I intentionally am end times agnostic, because I don't know of anyone who understands that book right, and I don't want to claim I do too. But it's been interesting that in the last 100 years or so, there's been kind of an image of the end of the world that's kind of emerged that looks a lot like the destruction of the Jewish temple. And a lot of these guys will quote the verses that's talking about the destruction of the Jewish temple and say, hey, it's going to happen in this generation, and then apply it onto us. Now, I know that the destruction in the Jewish temple and the day of the Lord are two different events, and it does seem like they're talking about them a little interchangeably, and it's hard to kind of understand which is which. But some of it had to only be the destruction of the Jewish temple, because Jesus himself said it's going to be this generation, not our generation, the generation he's in. And some of that is interesting because we've developed kind of a bleak picture in the last 100 years of Jesus coming back and then judging the whole world again. And then after that, events happen like the post-trib, the pre-trib, the rapture. All of these events kind of are getting painted in our worldview. Now, like I said, I don't want to endorse or non-endorse any of them. What I do want to say is actually a lot of these ideas haven't been around longer than 100 years. The people before 100 years really seemed to believe that society and that Christianity was going to be the leaven that would leaven the whole lump. Eventually, Christianity would spread throughout the world. All would come to know the glory of God. The message of the kingdom would be preached to every generation, and then Jesus would come back. By the way, just so you know, one thing that is not in debate is that Jesus is coming back. He is. It's kind of, what does the picture look like when he comes? Another thing that's very fascinating about this picture that I think is worth mentioning is during this 100 years, when things became more and more popular, we had events like World War I, the Spanish flu came in afterwards, which is an awful disease that a lot of people don't know about it. Then World War II came around with the development of nuclear weapons. Then we had to go through the Cold War, where we were continually faced and very afraid of the world kind of coming into annihilation. This backdrop of the world ending in either fire and ice is just kind of a big thing in our Western culture. I mean, right now, how many TV shows, movies, video games are about these apocalyptic or these world-ending events? It's something that's definitely, I'd say, in our Western conscious. And I just want to say, either way, if you subscribe to, kind of that end of the world view or not, just understand this, that it is kind of new, and it does sit kind of in those contexts. I don't want to tell you what to believe, because honestly, I'm not sure either, but I think it's important to know kind of the context. So the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple really was, in a way, though I'd say the church was birthed by Peter confessing that Jesus was Lord. And in that moment, Jesus said, I'm going to gather my church, a word that meant his gathering, actually a word that was commonly used in Greek in that time. I'm going to make my gathering about the people that believe that I was Jesus' Lord. That was probably the birth, but really what really started it, maybe our first steps or our first word, was the destruction of the Jewish temple. At that moment, we couldn't rely on the Jewish picture that we had been coasting on for the last 1,500 years of the people that followed God. In that moment, we knew that we had to start to define ourselves as something else. We couldn't ride on kind of the Jewish momentum. We had to learn how to survive on our own. As well as Christianity shifted as a population from something that was primarily Jewish, with Jewish worldviews, Jewish backgrounds, Jewish histories, to something that was more Gentile. The following years meant that we actually had to find an identity amidst kind of the chaos and kind of the crackdown of the Roman Empire, which never ended. It just shifted from in Jerusalem to outside of that. We had to learn how to define ourselves. We really had to learn who we are. And so thanks for joining me. I know this went long. I hope you found it informative. I find the series, these studies fascinating, because I didn't know that there were just not a lot of Christians in Jerusalem by that time. Just so you know, guys, I'm actually not super smart. I just read really smart people. A lot of the sources I'm getting is from this book by Bruce Shelley, this is Church History in Plain Language, the 4th edition. I hear it's actually an audio book too. It's a hefty read, but it's phenomenally written. If you want to learn more, pick up with that. I also am picking up and going through this book, Turning Points by Mark A. Knoll. It's a wonderful study of just kind of moments where church history kind of shifted. Those were a lot of my background sources. But next time and next month, we're going to jump into actually the age of Catholic Christianity. We're going to be talking about what really happened next. After Jerusalem was destroyed, most of the apostles are gone. We're now following people who followed the apostles. We had to face the Romans' continual persecution. We had to really find the truth of the gospel. We had to wind up standing up to heresies. But it's a fascinating time, because it's a time where there were no church divisions. There was just one church, and we had to figure out who we are. We've faced threats like heresies, and we had to continue to stay on the same page, being a bunch of people groups following God spread out all over the Mediterranean. But hey, thanks for joining me on the journey. I hope that this was informative and that you learned something. I really appreciate you guys' time. For those of you guys that that kept watching. I know this was kind of a hefty watch, but God bless you guys. Hopefully I'll get to see some of you guys at More Love, More Power coming up, but you guys are great. Thanks for joining us on the journey.